Hello and welcome. So, I wanted to create an opportunity to have a conversation, to give some information that could be an adjunct to some of the information that you're getting either from the book that I've sent you or a correspondence that we're having via email. There's a lot to the Be Strong, Be Wise program that is important to kind of think about and be aware of as you consider working with it, as we consider working together. So, in addition to the book, I wanted to just create a little bit of an opportunity to give some information on this webinar so that, again, if there's any questions you have or any particulars that you're wondering about, hopefully we'll be able to cover them today. So, to start, we are already unified in the fact that we care about young people. So, if you're watching this video, you're either a parent or a counselor or a teacher, you are working in some capacity with young people. And my guess is you care greatly about your job, you care greatly about the young people that are in your life. So we share that in common, which is why I wrote the book in the first place, why the Safety Ed program came into being, is because quite simply, I care about young people as much as you do. And it matters to me that we have this issue in our culture and in our world that we've done so little to address, and that is sexual assault response, prevention, and awareness. In my opinion, we've fallen far short of the mark in equipping the young people that we care about with the necessary internal wisdom and tools and strength and guidance that help them create safe outcomes in their life. So, the reason why the book came into being, and you can read about my story in the book, but I have been a psychotherapist responding to trauma, treating trauma for 20 plus years. And in my experience as a clinician, I've heard story after story after story of assaults that have taken place in young adulthood. And actually, there's a reason for that. The demographics speak to the reason for that. We have an assault every 92 seconds in our country currently, and half of all victims are between the ages of 18 and 34. And if you consider college freshmen versus a college senior, for example, college freshmen are going to be much more vulnerable to risk than a college senior would be. And in this day and age, when young people have a whole lot that they're exposed to through social media, through music videos, and all that technology has brought forward in our world, they don't necessarily have the internal awareness for how to take all that material and apply it to their own life. So, in my book, just as an example of this, in my book, I talk about the effects of pornography, especially on young men. And one of the tasks of the Be Strong, Be Wise program is to address how young men, young women, and non binary folks can lower risk of sexual assault. Now, part of that has to be the very sensitive and important step of educating young men on how to cultivate their inner champion, how to come to relationships in their life with a healthy mindset. And given the numbers that we're hearing around pornography exposure, for example, I think there's 68 million daily searches, and many young men are admitting to pornography addiction and using pornography, for self-pleasure. It's a very common outlet for young men. Well, 88% of those videos contain violence against women. So we have the job of trying to challenge and encourage our young men to cultivate the inner wisdom and strength needed to separate themselves out from that cultural force And it's a force that comes up in their group activities and group discussions with other young men. It's a force that comes up with some of the, popular statements that men make around the objectification of women. So young men are exposed to an awful lot of social conditioning around what it is to be, masculine in our culture. So one of the goals of the Be Strong, Be Wise program is to encourage a different way of thinking about relationships and sex and intimacy, and encouraging young men to develop what I call champion behavior, which is using the power of their masculinity as a protective force. So I bring that up as a way of talking about one of the challenges that we have as safety educators. And if you're watching this video and you're considering being a part of the Be Strong, Be Wise program, you will become a sexual safety educator. So one of the goals, of course, is to be very aware and sensitive around the possibility of victim blaming. And one of the goals is being very sensitive and aware in how to talk with young men in a way that encourages healthy behavior without making them feel as if they're a potential offender just because they're male. So I've talked a lot about that particular aspect, working with young men. I want to talk about working with young women for a second. So one of the things that I've heard an awful lot, and I've been talking to Title IX officers and counselors and guidance counselors and teachers, anybody that I can talk to who is working with young people currently. One of the things that I hear a lot is, well, why should we be training young women, for example? Why should we be educating young women on how to keep themselves safe when it's the offender's responsibility to not assault, to not offend? And that's a great question. And a lot of people working in, working to eradicate violence against women would say that we really need to have a very hard and firm line there in holding offenders accountable and not making women feel as if they are responsible for their own safety. So I really want to, state clearly that I support and respect that opinion. At the same time, as far as my purposes with the Be Strong, Be Wise program, I don't align with it. And this is where I think there's a lot of different ways to achieve the same goal. And I believe that, you and I are probably both really for eradicating violence against women. I do believe that as far as the young women that we are teaching, the young women that we are educating, if we don't give them the tools, if we don't give them the internal wisdom, self-understanding, the identification of red flags, the identification of group dynamics and ways to be safety-minded when out for an evening, for example, then we are actually compromising their individual agency. Because young women, and again, we're talking about high school age, college freshman, college sophomore, that kind of teen to young adult age bracket, there isn't necessarily the life experience or executive functioning in place to make those kind of decisions on their own. And, you can have a very smart and savvy young woman who is, perhaps got a great ability to read her internal red flags, for example. That young woman still hasn't necessarily ridden a subway in the middle of the night, or lived in a city in her own apartment, or gone to, if she's in high school, for example, gone to a college frat party yet. And these are all scenarios that, of course, are more likely to contain risky variables. So in my opinion, and in our program that we offer to young people, we look at this opportunity as an empowerment opportunity. And I've discussed how to empower young men, right? If young men are building their inner champion, they're more likely to have healthy relationships with women, which then, of course, feels good to them, helps them have healthier relationships with themselves. And the same is true for young women. If young women are given the tools and the inner wisdom and the ability to navigate complex social situations, whether that be romantic or platonic, they're more likely to feel confident, to feel powerful, to feel safe, to feel comfortable, to be able to bring their full authority to the table in the relationships in their life. So I wanted to just clarify our stance around victim blaming and around educating young women, young men, educating young women. And of course, everything that I've said applies to the LGBTQ and non-binary community, who are more at risk simply because of discrimination. And I believe that half of the participants in a recent study done by the National Transgender Society, half of all participants admitted that they had been sexually assaulted. So we have our work cut out for us in educating, all people, regardless of sexual identity or preference. We have, I believe, a responsibility for educating our young people on how to manage social situations and how to build self-knowledge, which is one of the primary goals in the Be Strong, Be Wise program. So I want to kind of segue now to talk about COVID. And COVID is, as we know, as you know, as I know, is a major hindrance, a major concern for all aspects of life currently. And of course, most importantly, because people are dying as a result of it. So we've got a new way, a new normal that we're all trying to make sense of in our lives. When it comes to the Be Strong, Be Wise program and COVID, I think there are three really important things to remember, because it would be very easy to say, there's a pandemic going on. Young people are not even hanging out with each other. Why would we talk about sexual safety in the midst of a pandemic? Here's why it's even more important in the midst of a pandemic to talk about sexual safety. First and foremost, young people have proven to be least likely to follow the regulations around social distancing. So first and foremost, and I think any Google search will find many articles where young people are even blatantly disregarding social distancing requirements. Secondly, young people are more likely to engage in drunken alcohol use, whether there is a pandemic or not. And thirdly, and this actually is the one that's most on my heart these days, because they are isolated, because they are at home with their parents, because they are isolated to their dorm rooms right now, if they are able to go to college, there is a whole false sense of security that is getting created internally for them. And I think that that sense of security is probably part of the reason why people might say, well, sexual safety is not a concern right now. We've got a pandemic. So people are, in that regard, safer than they were before. And I want to lean into that argument, because I do believe when you put young people who don't have a whole lot of life experience in an isolated scenario for however long, we've now been at, several months, if not half a year, under social restriction, and then you remove that social restriction, well, they've missed all that whole time frame of regulating themselves, navigating the social arena, of navigating romantic relationships and sexual relationships. They've been out of the world, so to speak, and thrusting them back into the world is possibly going to be pretty damaging if there isn't an internal system in place for re-entering the world in a safe way. So I want to offer that because I think it's an important piece of discussion as we look at how to manage COVID, how to continue to provide young people with what they need in order to have the fullest, most gratifying independence that they can. And I would say that, it starts with knowing who they are, knowing how to navigate the variables that involve risk. And again, if they're out of the world and they're not having to navigate them, they're going to be less prone to doing that when they are back in the world. So I've talked about a few different aspects. We know that this is a significant problem in our culture. I've mentioned there's an assault every 92 seconds. Um, Half of all victims being between the ages of 18 and 34. And the government spends more money treating the effects of sexual violence than it does treating any other violent crime. So survivors know, and I'm a survivor myself, and I've worked with survivors. Survivors know that sexual assault leaves a long-lasting imprint. And so we have, again, I believe, a mandate to bring forward the kind of education, the kind of discussion that helps young people figure out what they bring to the table when it comes to sexual safety. So again, I continue to mention, and you'll hear me say a lot as I talk about the program, that one of our primary goals is building self-knowledge. And the program is cumulative. There are 5 classes, and each of those 5 classes builds on the class before it. So it's comprehensive. And we actually start with a really broad view, and we narrow that view as we go forward in the program. So for example, in our first class, we talk about definition and overview of assault. Second class, we narrow the lens to talk about gender and culture. And I've shared a lot around gender and culture in my class today and talking with you guys. In class 3, we talk about peer relationships. We talk about the date rape drug and how to avoid the date rape drug when you're out with your friends for an evening, how to help keep each other safe, how to look at the red flags when out in a social scenario and people are drinking, how to navigate your power group, your friend group, in a way that helps each other stay safe. And there are very easy action steps that young people can learn about that allow them to continue to have fun without having to miss any freedom, without having to miss the enjoyment of this new independence, but still stay safe. And it's amazing to me when I've taught the classes so far, when I've heard young people say, oh, I've never thought about that. You know, one of the key tools or suggestions that we offer when it comes to drinking is to eat a meal before you go out at night with your friends. And this is the simplest, most basic, most common sense step that a lot of us, if we were the type to go out and enjoy a few drinks on a Saturday night, by the time we were in our mid-20s, we knew, right? Have something to eat before you go out. Well, young people haven't learned that yet. They haven't been in the world long enough yet. So some of these suggestions are very, very pragmatic, especially in this particular class that discusses peer relationships. So, and the Be Strong, Be Wise program, another one of our goals, so we talked about self-knowledge is our first goal. Our second goal is to create a language for discussing sexual safety. We don't have a language yet. It's a subject that creates a lot of fear. It creates a lot of hesitancy and concern. It creates a lot of discomfort. And so we don't like to talk about uncomfortable things, especially with our children who we've done everything to make really comfortable, right? So that's our second goal, is to create a language to make it more ordinary, more commonplace to discuss sexual safety. And also to identify, this is our third goal, to help young people identify the variables that influence assault outcomes. And this is another way in which we avoid victim blaming, because I don't call the program a sexual assault prevention program. I describe it as a program that equips young people with the tools and inner wisdom that lowers risk. And one of the ways that we lower risk is to help young people identify variables. One of those variables is alcohol. So we do a lot of discussing in class 3 alcohol use, since 50% of assaults, the victims were under the influence at the time, and in 63% of assaults, the offender was under the influence. So we need to talk about alcohol, even with students who perhaps have never had a drop of alcohol in their life. So that's class 3. In class 4, we talk about self-knowledge. We look at brain functioning. We look at the autonomic nervous system, fight, flight, or freeze. We have discussion points and activities and exercises that help students figure out what their defensive style is and how they can begin to explore some new avenues, how they can empower themselves with using their voice, for example. And in class 4, we talk about the 5 safety tools. And by the end of the Be Strong, Be Wise program, I can assure you that every student knows fully what those 5 safety tools are and how to apply them to their life. So one example of a tool is gut instinct. I believe gut instinct is the most important of our 5 tools. And in class 4, we talk at length about how to listen to your red flags, how to tune in to your intuition. And there are ways to encourage young people to begin to reflect a little bit more when they are out in public, when they're on a date with somebody new, when they're even just hanging out with their roommate, having a discussion. There's a way that young people can tune in and just notice how they're feeling about a certain subject that's being talked about or something that somebody said. So this is just an example of one of our tools, and an example of how we bring that forward to the students that go through the program. As I said, there are role play, there is written exercises, there's group discussion, which is super important for teaching young people, especially about sexual safety. Every class has a lecture portion and then a group discussion portion. And I've had students say, you know, I've never had a class that was so easy to talk in. It's just so conversational. I feel so comfortable. And that's because we have to be comfortable as educators talking about a subject that most people find very uncomfortable. And I think that's one of the primary aspects of the Be Strong, Be Wise program that sets it apart, is that it's so structured that there is that the comfort's kind of built in. If we follow the steps in the program, we don't leave a stone unturned. We address every aspect of sexual safety in a way that allows young people to feel like they're part of the process. We're partners in creating, you know, a safer world. And in all my students, I say to them at the end of the program, you're now a safety ambassador. So carry it forward, pay it forward, bring this information to your friends, to the people that you care about. So I want to invite you to have a conversation with me after you've seen this class. I've tried to give you just kind of a thumbnail sketch of what to anticipate in working with this program and working with me. And but I love talking about this stuff. So I'm happy to answer any questions or look at how this particular program can meet the needs of the students at your particular school. So just to close up, I want to look at, you know, some of the things that are challenging, some of the things that we want to look out for in discussing sexual safety, especially in our current climate. I've talked about victim blaming, which I think is one of the primary obstacles to sexual safety. Sexism and homophobia are pretty obvious examples of obstacles. It's much easier to target somebody that you view as an object. And so that's partly why we have the numbers as high as we do, because we haven't dealt with some of these societal forces. So they're continuing to haunt us, and they're continuing to compromise the lives of the young people that we care about. Racism is another obstacle. Women of color, for example, are much more likely to be victimized by sexual assault. And again, similar to homophobia, there is discrimination, racism sets apart others as being less than. And so there's a more likelihood that those people will be targeted. And in talking about sexual safety and sexual safety education, we got to be aware of some of these things because we'll probably want to bring that forward in our group discussion. We're going to want to recognize and acknowledge that to our students of color, to our students who identify as non-binary. We're going to want to create room for that kind of discussion. So a couple of other obstacles, and this is has to do with the age bracket that we're working with. One of the things that I've seen happen a lot is there will be an assault that takes place, for example, at a local high school, which we've had, unfortunately, far too many stories recently. But an assault takes place, and the response on the part of the students can be wildly polarized. And my guess is if you're an educator or a counselor, you've observed this for yourself. So I've heard stories where a young man was accused of assaulting a young woman, and all of her friends were so enraged by this event. And again, they have a right to be angry, but that anger translated to ostracizing this young man, so much so that he had to switch schools. He completely lost his face in the community, lost face with the peers that he was close to, not so close to. He was rejected across the board. Conversely, I've heard stories of young women who were victimized, and because of victim blaming, were targeted by the offender's friend group, and again ostracized by the school for making up a story about this very popular senior boy. So in either one of these scenarios, with this polarized reaction, whether it be pro-victim or pro-offender, nobody's learning anything in the process. So there may be very, grandiose steps taken on the part of peers and friends to defend their friend who has been assaulted, for example. But that's not creating a learning opportunity where choices can be made that create safe outcomes, that help people feel confident, that help young men learn how to develop champion behavior, for example. It's just a lot of drama. And I think that there's a place for that. And we're in a time where we need to have people taking a stand for what they believe in. But we also need to have our young people learning from that and learning how to, look out for each other and how to be more safety minded in the world in general. So these are just some obstacles to look at, to be aware of as we go forward. And I invite you to think about some of the stuff that we've talked about in today's webinar. Think about whether there are any particular questions that you have for me. This is certainly something that you can begin to do on your own in having conversations with young people about what the definition of sexual assault even is. Just a side note, I've been amazed at how many students don't really know the full definition of sexual assault. Helping young people look at some of the stories that have made the news and begin to identify the variables that went into that story. For example, alcohol, whether there was alcohol involved, to begin to look at how they feel about their own voice and their ability to communicate their needs. There's lots of different ways to approach this. So I invite you to explore your way, and I invite you to consider working with me, to consider partnering as safety ambassadors, so that we can give the students at your particular school all the benefit of this very comprehensive and rich safety ed program. So you can see I'm a full believer, and I'm happy to talk about it at any other point. So reach out to me if you'd like to schedule a call, and thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Be well.